Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon to our audience and panelists today. On behalf of the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, member of the World Bank Group that focuses on supporting the development of the private sector in emerging markets, I thank you all for joining this webinar brought to you by the IFC Green Banking Academy. I really hope that you and your loved ones continue to be healthy in these challenging times. Let me briefly introduce myself. I'm Marcela Ponce. I'm responsible for the Climate Finance Program of the Financial Institutions Group in Latin America and the Caribbean. Our program provides financing, advisory services, and knowledge to our client financial institutions in the region with a key goal to support the transformation journey of financial institutions in the region, banks, insurance company, and other financial institutions to go from business as usual to sustainable and responsible financing. One of our main priorities, of course, is to promote climate finance to mitigate and adapt to the impact of climate change. This is our sixth webinar of a series of webinars that we have been holding every week under the title of Ctrl+Alt+Delete, Green Rebuild. And this title has a powerful meaning. Control means that we shall aim to take control over the future of our world, the world that we live in, and to make it better for us and for the future generations. Alt stands for alternative and means that there are better alternatives to what we are doing today in many ways, and therefore we shall stop doing those ones that are not beneficial for the persons or for the planet. And delete means that it is in our hands to erase and rectify the mistakes of the past and work for a better future for everyone. So this webinar series is proposing a full reboot. The current crisis is providing us with a chance to rethink what we are doing and rebuild in a greener way. The world is changing from economic, political, social, and business standpoints, and the sustainable economy represents a unique opportunity to rebuild a more dynamic, resilient, and competitive society. With this, let me spend just a few minutes to refresh some logistics. Today, we will have a 45-minute discussion and 15 minutes for Q&A. If there are many questions, we may extend for an additional 10 minutes to take them. So please use the Q&A section of the WebEx to post your questions or comments. Please remember that at the end of the webinar, there will be a short survey, and we would greatly appreciate if you take some time to fill it in. It is a very short survey, please believe me. So with this, I'm very happy to introduce our today's moderator, Anaís Furia. Anaís is an investment officer in IFC's Health and Education team in Latin America and the Caribbean. She joined IFC in 2013 in Paris, investing in healthcare, life sciences, and retail projects with European sponsors. She then relocated to Washington, D.C., working across regions, focusing on transactions in health, life sciences, and education. Prior to joining IFC, Anaís worked on a mobile healthcare diagnostic project in Nambia, was also a member of Ardian's private equity funds team and HSBC's equity research team covering food retailers. She also worked for a French M&A boutique. She holds a Master of Science in Finance and a Bachelor's in Economics from Paris Dauphine University. Anaís will be moderating our fantastic thought leaders and speakers today, Professor Jose Maria Ordovás, a well-renowned and a global authority in nutrition and genomics, and his son, Dr. Jose Manuel Ordovás-Montañes, a renowned immunologist working on the COVID battle. And basically, just anticipating the contents of this interesting discussion today, let me share with you my thoughts. We are what we eat, and therefore we need to guarantee food quality, standards, and security, which can all be done by providing the right climate finance in the world. So without further ado, Anaís, the floor is yours.
And we're seeing
Marcela, toma la palabra porque no se está oyendo Anaís, por favor.
Let me pass the word to Luis Fuente. Luis Fuente is an operations officer, part of the climate finance team in Latin America and the Caribbean, quite focused on the implementation of advisory projects for our client banks, where we have a lot of action in Latin America and the Caribbean. So over to you, Luis.
Thank you, Marcela. Thank you so much. And thank you for the introduction. I feel very proud of having our colleagues, Jose Ordovás and his son, having and holding this discussion. And I would like to start moderating this conversation, and then if we finally achieve the Anais can connect, then I'll pass the word to her. But then I will start the discussion with you guys, asking you, why is climate resilience such an important topic to both of you as persons and researchers in genetics? And maybe we can use some presentation or have a discussion with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luis. I need the privilege of the moderator to share the screen, please.
Excellent. So while we're getting the presentation up, I think I can start discussing a little bit about that, just from a personal perspective. I think that, climate change is something that touches all of us, and it's something that we can learn a lot from. And so at first, something as seemingly disparate as climate change and COVID-19, we may not immediately think that they are related, but they're actually related both in terms of how they've presented, and there are some really tight links between climate and emerging global pandemics. And so, kind of what have I learned from this, and what have I learned from climate change? If I heard your question correctly, Luis, for me, we really look at this flattening the curve scenario, and flattening the curve is something that is hard to do, but there are some very simple rules. The earlier that you intervene, the less you'll have to intervene, and the later that you intervene in this process, then the harder you will have to push on that curve to bring it down. So on the left, we can look at two scenarios of how CO2 emissions are rising dramatically, and how if we intervened in the year 2000 or if we intervened in the year 2020 to achieve the same amount of change, our rate of change needs to be dramatically higher. And the same is true for COVID. So the longer that we waited, or in some countries are still waiting for the appropriate and commensurate response, we will need to push down harder on that curve. It means that what could have been staved off through traditional public health measures are now things that we need to consider what the actual level is of our healthcare system capacity, where we probably thought that we were not anywhere near it. But one simple virus of less than 30,000 DNA base pairs, to bring the genes element into this discussion, has been able to completely overwhelm that in many so-called highly developed countries. And so, the first lesson here, I think, is that the higher any curve goes, whether it is of temperature or whether it is of the spread of SARS-CoV-2 that causes COVID-19, the harder it is to flatten. And so, next slide, please. And so when we think about things that are growing, I think we typically think of positive elements, right? If we talk about growth in food, or if we talk about growth in stock markets, or if we talk about regeneration of cells, for example, to think about 3 different scales, we view growth as a tremendously positive element. But if instead I reframe that as saying that we've had a growth in temperature, and that we have had a growth in our stock markets, but we've actually had a loss in diversity of the amount of companies that are participating in that stock market, and the benefits that people stand to gain from that. And that we have a growth in cells that is so great that by another name, it's called cancer. And so things that have been tightly linked to climate change and stock markets and cells are the emergence of single species ecosystems. And it's clear that at any level of resolution, and I challenge anyone actually to, if they do have an example of a single species ecosystem that can thrive. So I think one important lesson here at all scales of the planet down to cells is that single species ecosystems are not going to be thriving ecosystems. And so next slide, please. And so what we've now, to kind of flip the question back to Luis and Anais, what have we learned from coronavirus, and what can climate change learn from coronavirus? Well, the climate change experiment is really hard to do because the changes tend to be measured on the order of years or decades or even centuries. But here, thinking about the flattening of the curve in coronavirus, we have basically a real-time experiment. We're talking about days on the graph that we're looking at. We're talking about the days that it took to completely flatten the curve in New Zealand, the few days longer that it took in Spain, and then the action that was taken afterwards. And then in United Kingdom, how that curve is slowly finally coming down to the ground. Then in the United States, we have an example where that curve appeared to buckle, but then has shot right back up at even a higher rate of change. And so this is an important lesson in the fact that whenever we apply a change, we need to sustain it. And that's hard, but it's necessary to achieve change. And it's particularly hard when we're not able to see the results. But here again, we can see these results. We appreciate the climate change and coronavirus are maybe following some similar rules as to how hard that curve needs to be pushed down. And so I think that there's important lessons that we can take from both. And so next slide. And one thing further to kind of bring these two ideas together, we probably didn't think that a viral pandemic was going to be such an amazing opportunity to end some of the kind of longstanding institutions that have been driving a lot of our energy consumption. So this opportunity to really reinvent and restart the way that we've been viewing energy consumption and production, moving from oil towards things like wind and solar, we probably didn't think that it was going to be tightly linked to a viral pandemic, but it's something that we need to take advantage when these opportunities arise. And we need to think that, yes, it's important to be rebooting and restarting the economy, but it's important to be doing that in a way that is responsible and equitable. And so these moments are possible, but we need to really seize on them. And so I think, that's kind of what climate change means for me, and what coronavirus can mean for climate change in some ways.
I think we still have some issues, right?
Yes, we still have some internet issues with Anais, so I'll invite Luis Fuente to keep moderating the session.
Sure, definitely. Thank you so much, Jose Manuel. I'd like to pass the word as well to your father, Jose Maria. And I didn't introduce him. Jose Maria Ordovás-Montañes is a PhD, is a professor of nutrition and a pioneer, and one of the world's leading specialists in nutrigenomics. He directs the Laboratory of Nutrition and Genetics at the USDA Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging, Tufts University in Boston, USA, group leader at the Madrid Institute of Advanced Studies in Food, and researcher at the National Center of Cardiovascular Research in Spain. And his research focuses on the genetic, epigenetic, and microbiota factors that predispose individuals to chronic age-related diseases, as well as their interactions with the environmental, dietary, and behavioral factors. He has published over 900 scientific articles in peer-reviewed journals and has written numerous reviews and books on these topics. Currently, he is the president of the multidisciplinary group of scientists that advise on COVID-19 related issues to the Spanish Ministry of Science and Innovation. And welcome as well, Jose Maria, and thank you for joining us in this discussion as well with your son. And to follow up the discussion, I would like to ask as well to both of you, because this is a topic that has been throughout the conversation that we had in the last question. We would like to talk about resilience, and it's something. You talk about a lot of tipping points and points of no return if we act later, right? So talking about resilience, in your opinion, how has the world developed shock absorbers, and how has it adapted to avoid these losses, generally speaking? And I'll pass the word to both of you. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think it's important to flip to the next slide and then also unmute on that end. And I'll give the word to Jose Maria on the other side.
I think you're on mute. Jose Maria.
There we go.
Yeah. Yes, a moment. I cannot unmute myself. Are you hearing me?
You're
Yes,
unmuted
you're
now.
unmuted.
We can hear you.
Okay.
I was afraid that I was going to have to start talking about food, but I only like to eat it. So we'd rather hear from the expert in the room, I think.
Thank you so much. All right. So as I was saying before, even though I may not have been here, is that in the title of this webinar, we have foods, plates, and we have genes. And this is a good point precisely to talk about this concept of shock absorbers, but at a different level, longer term level. Unlike other species in which their survival depends on very specific conditions, humans have demonstrated very well that we can survive everywhere. And this capacity obviously was not optimized in our African ancestors, where we are supposed to all have evolved, right? But in reality, it has been, this capacity has been acquired through many generations of exposure to different foods, climates, latitudes, altitudes, and so on. And of course, pathogens. And this capacity has been evolved by mutations that have been taking place in our genome, random mutations, but that they favor those that could survive in specific conditions and reproduce better. And that's why precisely that concept of evolution that has taken, as I mentioned before, thousands of years, or even tens of thousands of years or more, right? So our genes have been like these shock absorbers in this difficult and long trip out of Africa. And we have, in this slide, we have some examples of that. And for example, we have adapted to live in the different climates. So people in the Eskimos, people in Siberia, they have a genetic makeup that facilitates them to survive in those conditions. The same thing happens, for example, in the Himalayas or the Andes with people that live under low oxygen pressures, right? But it's not only the geography, it's not only the latitude, it's also what we eat. And I am going to illustrate, there are many examples. There are how we have evolved to survive like the Eskimos out of fat and protein, because that's what they have around, right? But two examples that are wonderful are the ones that made us able to thrive or survive or use dairy, milk during all our lives, and also how we were able to fight one of the major killers of humanity that has been malaria. So here, in this slide, I am going to talk precisely to that in that topic of the adult lactase persistence. Let me explain. So we have dairy, we have milk, and in the mind of the nutritionist, you can think that this is good, this is bad, but let's forget about the present moment and let's talk about evolution. So in all different mammal species, there is a period of their lives in which consuming that milk is essential before weaning. And then what happens is that in that milk, we have lactose. That's the major sugar, we can say, that we have in milk. And then that lactose is processed by an enzyme in the gut. And people use, or the babies use that nutrient, right? Very happily. But then after weaning, what we have is a situation in which, as you see in the middle part of the slide, that enzyme that processes the lactose goes down, practically disappears, and then if an adult or an animal from another adult animal from another species consume that milk, then the lactose is not processed by us, but is processed by the bacteria, by bacterial fermentation in those bacteria that we have in the gut. And then we generate gas, we generate acids, and we generate a very unpleasant feeling, flatulence, abdominal pain, and so on. So it's not really good, right? But something happens in our human history that changed that. And nowadays, as you can see on the right part of the slide, you have a proportion of people that even in their very adult lives, they can very happily drink that milk, and other people that remain having those unpleasant feelings, right, or effects. And in the map, you see the hotspots, how that is distributed, where is that 1/3 of the human population that don't have any problem with milk, and the other ones that do have. So how all that started, or why we have this situation, and then we have to go back to our genes, to those random mutations that I was telling you about, and let's position ourselves back in the time of the agricultural revolution. Our lifestyle, our culture entirely changed about 20,000 years ago, and somewhere, between 10,000, 11,000 years ago, something happens. One of these random mutations happened in a human, and then that random mutation made that human was able to drink milk during the entire life, his or her entire life. Well, if that didn't have any positive effect, well, probably that would have been extinguished. I will not be talking about this now. But apparently, in that time in history, to be able to digest and be able to assimilate milk during your entire life made you, let's say, at an advantage over your other neighbors, right? So that mutation serves as a shock absorber. We don't know exactly about against what, right? Malnutrition, because the persons with that mutation could eat things that other people couldn't eat in a time in which it was not so easy to eat as it is nowadays, or maybe against infectious diseases, the topic that is of our major interest nowadays. Why? Because people start to aggregate in cities. Then probably water was not as safe as we have it now. So to have something that was sterile, if we can say that, or it was not dangerous, like milk, could have allowed people to survive, whereas other people were being killed, right? Anyway, that was very positive and just spread like, let's say, fire around the world, specifically in the center of Europe, in the northern Europe, and that's where you have seen the previous slides, the hot spot of this shock absorber. So that's one example of how we have been acquiring that phenotypic flexibility to afford living in environments or in situations that we were not familiar before because of the changes in our genome. Obviously, every action has a reaction, and it could look great back then, but we have also influenced our environment. Our genome has influenced our environment. And now we have all these kind of genetic changes that we have introduced or selected for in terms of cows, for example, for meat, for dairy, and so on. But also that kind of exploitation of that resource. We need food for the cattle, and we need room for the cattle, and then we have created changes in the ecosystem, deforestation, and so on. So that's a lesson that we have to learn, that every action has a reaction. Let's move to the malaria. Malaria has been, as I mentioned before, a major killer along human history. Even nowadays, we have precisely this. Every year we have the same number of people dying of malaria that we had with COVID, about 500,000. And we think that we have made big improvements over the over previous decades, most of them in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is how we have, our genome has adapted to that, how our culture has adapted to that danger. So we have the life cycle of the Plasmodium. As you know, the origin comes from the mosquito. The mosquito bites, and then people are infected, and then the cycle starts again after the infected cells are taken by another mosquito. All right, and things keep going on. So what happens from the point of view of the genome? We have along thousands, tens of thousands of years, what we have developed is a positive selection and a strong selective pressure for resistance to malaria. So there are mutations in our genes that, interestingly enough, they are associated in the normal period of the normal people with disease. For example, sickle cell anemia, thalassemia, and so on. That makes people sick. But what happens is that sickness, that weakness of our system, puts the people affected into a big advantage when they are confronted with the mosquito, with the malaria, because now that system that we have is not strong enough. The Plasmodium cannot reproduce, and then the ball stops there, right? So that's a great example of how we have created a shock absorber against infectious diseases from the point of view of the genome. But let's move to food. We have another example like favism, people that cannot eat fava beans because they have something similar to what we were describing for, consuming milk in the adult life. So it's people sick, some people sick. But what happens if you eat fava beans during the season of malaria? Well, it weakens your system. It makes your red cells more prone to oxidation and so on. So what you have is a weak human, but it's also weak for the reproduction of the parasite. And then first, there is not enough. The human is not affected not to be killed, and also it just stops the transmission. And if in addition to this, you add the cultural tradition of adding spices and herbs, like for example satar, that makes you even probably worse, but it even protects you more. So you have this synergy between the traditional cultures embedded in the food and also our genetic evolution. So just to conclude this, let me tell you that yes, our foods shape our genome, but our genomes have shaped our foods and our world. And when we put something on the table, we can just practically we can put names to each one of those drinks or foods, right? In which something has evolved during the last tens of thousands of years in order to make us able to eat that and to prosper on that. It could be alcohol, it could be milk, as we mentioned before, it could be seafood, it could be bitter foods. So that's an important message in terms of how we have been able to really create those shock absorbers.
Thank you, Jose Maria, and I hope you can now hear me correctly. And I had a question for Jose Manuel, because you really talked about the nutrition aspect and how we adapted to this, and I wanted to know on the cell side, on the immune system side, Jose Manuel, if you could tell us and give us some example as well.
Yeah, so the scale that I like to think on a lot is cells. And of course, cells are going to reflect a product of their genes, and then the organisms are going to be a product of their cells. And I think it's really interesting to think about actually what the immune system has taught us about resilience. So without getting into the specific kind of acrobatics that are used by the so-called T cells and B cells that actually adjust their genes and their capacity to basically be ready for anything. If we actually think about how the way that the immune system has evolved, it doesn't make sense from an economic standpoint. It invests a ton of energy or currency in being able to be ready for almost anything. And that's actually the only reason that we're being saved right now, is because we have these millions or billions of different T cells and B cells that we keep around just in case one of them gets selected and is reactive to the right virus, in this case SARS-CoV-2, but also for influenza or for malaria that was just being discussed. And whether they be T cells or B cells, they kind of follow similar rules to some extent, as far as individual clones being selected and then being really critical. So even though on the right, what we can detect eventually looks like a reaction, that we have these rises in antibodies that come up after a virus was introduced into the system. What we don't see, and what we're usually not as good at measuring in all of these tests, is the fact that these cells need to be around beforehand. And so I would just highlight this as an amazing example of how the adaptive immune system has these amazing principles of resilience, and how important it is to invest in keeping these around, again, for those just in case moments.
Thank you very much, Jose Maria, Jose Manuel, and I think it's a very important point that you're doing here, drawing on as well the COVID-19. Just stepping back, Jose Manuel, how would you link that to climate change? Because we went pretty deep into our human body and the cell. So how do we get back to our topic? Of climate change?
Yeah, that's good. I mean, the cell is kind of my comfort level of resolution, but these things are all tied together, as you allude to. So if I can get the next slide, we are really, as I mentioned, the organisms are a product of their cells, and you might think, well, how do you go from cells to the globe so quickly? But I'll highlight this. If we had in all of us cells that were at the ready to go and responding to SARS-CoV-2, we hopefully wouldn't be having this conversation each secluded within our own rooms, right? Practicing kind of social distancing to the best measures. And so what happens locally, and I'm talking locally, not even how people are acting, but how our cells are acting, can influence global activities. And this is something that I think COVID-19 has directly pushed on, and it's something that climate change directly pushes on. So when you look at the map of the way that countries have responded or poorly responded to COVID-19, and you look at how countries are supposed to have responded, in this case illustrating the Paris Agreement on the left, and potentially how poorly they are responding to what they said they were going to do, you might think that we have no chance to actually overcome these kind of planetary scale issues. But then locally, we can take action. So each one of us as individuals can take action to isolate, and that can help to prevent global pandemics. Each one of us as individuals can make conscious choice every day about how we are spending our energy resources. And that is all intrinsically linked. And so if I had drawn arrows, at first when I was making this slide, I started to put arrows together, and I realized that there were arrows pointing to everything. And that, viruses and climate change are operating on the scales that we're illustrating here, but also more so. And so if you flip to the next slide, one thing that I think is really important to understand in thinking about the slide that I showed a few back about how the US is rapidly rebounding, we need to learn how to make these transient responses long-term adaptive responses that we're remembering. And so if you click once more, what you'll see is that if we consider here, our pathogen curve in black, or in this case, it could be temperature rise as well. We have a particular response to that. And that response is something that we can remember, that our T cells and B cells, hopefully next time that there's a global pandemic, aren't playing catch up. In the same way as if we are able to build more resilient systems that are investing in sustainable elements that are meant to prevent climate change at the same time as they can encourage sustainable business growth, we need to think about new ways of quantifying those elements and what the costs and benefits are and what the trade-offs are of keeping some of those memories and some of that preparedness around within our either financial markets or within the cells within our body. And again, to kind of tie that global and local scale together. So I think, that's kind of how I would link climate change, COVID, and what's happening locally within our cells and at a global scale around the world too.
Thank you. That's very clear, Jose Manuel. And I think, you started kind of, mentioning this, but I guess the very straightforward question then is, you said we need to think about new ways of funding. So you have a crowd today of mainly private sector representative investors. What could they do to solve the funding issue and to develop those shock absorbers? And if you had to convince them, why does it make sense to do so? So it would be a question for both of you to address, please.
Yeah, I think what maybe it makes sense to address first the why it makes sense to do so, and then we can give an example as to actually how opposite it is what we're doing right now to what actually should be happening. So I'll flip the floor back to the other Jose.
All right, thank you. So for that, I am going to use as a case example precision nutrition in the times of COVID. Right? It's obvious, we all know how scientists are working to develop vaccines, therapies, and so on. And suddenly, in the eyes of the regular people, scientists exist, right? We become important. But it's not only all scientists, but specifically also the nutrition scientists recognize how important is nutrition, specifically precision nutrition, to support the physical, the mental, and the emotional resilience. Also, let's keep in mind that heterogeneity that we have in the expression of a disease. Some people may be infected and they don't even realize. And other people, unfortunately, they end up dying. So that it's important that we identify what makes people go in one direction or another. All right. So precision nutrition. First, we have to keep in mind that nutritional interventions, they take weeks, months, or even years to have their effect, right? Therefore, whether it's traditional nutrition or precision nutrition, that's not a magic bullet in this moment of the viral pandemic. It's not going to solve the problem right away, like it will happen with vaccines and so on. We can think about that more like a shield. It protects us more. It makes, if you allow me to say that, it makes our immune system stronger, right? And more protective until this new attack. So, because we are focusing in terms of business models in precision nutrition, we have to first define precision nutrition. And believe it or not, it's not defined. Not even the term is precise, because some people call it personalized nutrition, individualized nutrition, nutrigenomics, and so on. But the way that we have defined it is as an approach that uses information on the individual characteristics to develop targeted nutritional advice, products, or services. And the purpose is just to assist the individual in achieving a lasting dietary behavior change that is beneficial for health. So, in terms of how we get to understand, to measure that individuality, well, we use all this technology that we have developed over the last few years, metabolomics, genetics, genomics, and all these measures, real time or not real time, of our environment, what we call the exposome, how we respond to food. So what questions have been planting in our brains for the last few decades, more and more during the last few years, is how much variability exists between people. Do we really need that personalization? Because if everybody is the same, well, who cares, right? Just continue business as usual. What explains those differences? That's key. That's what we are trying to understand. And then the last point is, can we predict individual responses so we can put each one of us in the right track to prevent disease, whether that's weight gain or diabetes or cancer or whatever, right? Then this is a real example of how much variability we have in the population, and this is from a recent study that we published last week in Nature Medicine, and that is represents over 1,000 individuals. And what we have in the different panels, I mean, we give these people the same food, and we measure how they respond over time in terms of triglycerides in plasma, which is a measure of risk of heart disease, or glucose that everybody associates with diabetes, and the same thing for insulin. So traditionally, what we have done is to go after those blue or red lines. Okay, so that's how people respond, the average, right? But obviously, the average doesn't really even start providing what is happening to each one of us. And then we see people that really are very different from the mean. And we have to understand why and how we can bring them to that healthier mean, right? So this is a hypothetical scenario of precision nutrition in the COVID era. So one of these people that under their habitual diet respond poorly to the diet with huge excursions of glucose, that is going to favor the development of diabetes, and then you will see very high levels of glucose. And the same, I mean, if we have high levels of glucose, we have diabetes, that puts you in that subset of the population that are going to respond very poorly to the infection. They are going to end up in the ICU and maybe hooked to ventilators or even die. But let's think about that we are able to identify, predict that, and change that course of the personal history of the individual by providing a precision diet. Then we will not have that rise in the glucose. It will be normal. It will not, the diabetes will not develop, and then we will have an individual that will be walking around very happily with a mask, of course, and it will not be subjected to the poor outcomes of the disease, of the current disease. How we can make that hypothetical situation to the real situation? Well, very simple. Just providing the right funding of solid research so we can develop all these tools that will benefit the entire humankind in terms of
and I think, you know, regarding those tools and really the ways that we need to change the way that science funding is taking place is that if you flip to the next slide, is that science funding is the opposite of resilient. It is purely reactive in many cases, not always, but in many cases. And so on the left, what I'm showing here is a very alarming graph, which is the way that coronavirus research was funded. We can basically see that in years after the original SARS epidemic or after the MERS outbreak, there was a transient spike that barely lasted a year. And so that means that any researcher, because at the end of the day, researchers are people too. So any researcher that said, I am going to make a career out of coronavirus was taking a huge risk in their own personal future trajectory. Because if they invested in the first SARS and the public or private companies then said, you know, that's not really something that we're comfortable investing in, they might be out of a job. And so what we see now is that there has been a tremendous rise in funding. We can see on the right how there were two little blips in papers that arose from SARS and from MERS. And now there's a giant blip as far as current literature produced on coronavirus, but we need to be asking ourselves, are the numbers of papers really the correct metric for impact? So if you go to the next slide, what we see is that these papers have been traditionally very concentrated. They've been traditionally very concentrated within a couple of countries. And so this graph on the left, and full disclosure, this is through February. So I think that this distribution has changed dramatically since then, or I hope it's changed dramatically. But up until February of 2020, China, the United States, and Canada, and a few other countries had contributed the majority of knowledge to coronavirus. If we contrast that to the right of the current distribution of coronavirus cases, we see that there are countries that had never published in coronavirus that are being very hardly hit by it. And so we need to diversify our investment in science, not only in the topics, but in the way that countries can also become part of this conversation. And that enables being able to move resources nimbly, being able to empower people locally in those communities, and also being able to make sure that they sense that there's a solid future for a scientific career. So if we go to the next slide.
And Jose Manuel, sorry to interrupt you. I think, if we could answer, this question maybe a little bit faster, and then go to the last question, because we're almost running out of time. So point taken, there is a financial case for all of us to find new ways of funding the scientific research. We just can't keep on going, as you've shown on those graphs, with reactive reaction, and then forgetting, then losing our memory, and forgetting that we still need to have this financing mechanism for research. So if you could wrap up this one, and then maybe, my last question is really going to be about what can we do about this, to lower those environmental risks, improve, our health outcome, strengthen shock absorber. So just wanted to wrap it up. So I think that
this slide actually perfectly highlights that. So regarding, is this a transient adaptation or a longer term memory? We already see that the well of resources for COVID-19 basic research is starting to dry up. So this is clearly not over. There are more cases now than there were at any point, and yet the funding opportunities are already diminishing. And so the scientific funding response is simply not commensurate with the impact that this has had on GDP. So if we think that on the left, we're talking about the scale of, millions of dollars, on the right, we're talking about, I don't know, I simply don't understand. You all are the experts in that. I don't understand sums of money that is that large, but these are clearly not paired in my mind. And I think it takes an economist or a scientist to kind of make that link. And so I think, as you mentioned, in the interest of time and to be able to get to the questions and answers, what we can do is actually jump the next couple of slides and go to the last element that we had prepared. I think that, this element of vaccines actually touches on some of the question and answers that I'm seeing come through. And so we can return to that. But if we jump to the one about what are the factors that have actually increased this environmentally, so a couple more, then we can kind of wrap up and think about how environment are tied to these health risks and how we actually need to be solving these problems together. So one more. And do you want to take over here?
Yeah. Okay. So what we have to understand first is what has created the problem, and this is how all this started with a zoonosis. And what are the factors that increase the appearance of a zoonosis? Well, we know them. We are living them or suffering them. Deforestation, and we talk about that in the case in a few slides ago. The illegal and poorly regulated wildlife trade, the intensified agriculture and livestock production, and the climate change that we have discussed already. So let's put an example on the example on the right to see how in another disease that is more local, because it's from the northeast of the US, how this invasion of the natural territory is affecting a disease like Lyme disease. And then in the natural environment of our forest, you have the opossum in the forest, and these animals first. Let me track back. How Lyme disease is transmitted through ticks. Ticks are infected by bacteria, and then those ticks are take the bacteria from other animals, and then they transmit them to the humans, right? But in the natural environment, the opossum was first, it was not a good host for the bacteria, and second, they were great about cleaning those ticks from the environment. Now we have pushed those opossums out, and then we have the mouse. The mouse is a great host for the bacteria, and also they don't know how to clean and groom. So we have the forest infected with or populated with ticks that are infected, and then now is a real danger for the human in certain areas to walk around freely, right? So these are examples of how we are the effect on the environment is really favoring the transmission of these infectious diseases. And very quickly, again, what we are here describing is the weak points that we have in all this system, right? And by knowing them, how to improve them. We have two pandemics going at the same time. The COVID-19 that is new, and the obesity that has been going on for years. So what is the common link? That's, again, dietary habits, nutrition. We have very poor dietary habits that influences the development of chronic diseases, like the case of obesity. And again, as we mentioned in the case of diabetes, these are the people that are going to suffer more from the infection with the virus. So how we can go about improving this? Well, improve the nutrition. And there has been collateral damage, and this is precisely to the lack of resilience in the system. And let's just very quickly go over this example. What we have is New York through this year in terms of excess mortality compared to previous years. So we see the black line, and it is, I mean, people were not dying this year more than previous years, but suddenly COVID attacks, and then we have a huge increase, obviously, in the death by COVID. But also an overall death. Why? Well, it's because the hospitals were saturated, people were avoiding going to the doctor, even for heart attacks, and also things that they are great for prevention, and even more for prevention, for therapy, were just postponed, like cancer treatments, surgeries, and so on. So you can see that lack of resilience in the health system has created all these problems. Lack of resilience that, for example, is illustrated in the four pictures here that shows how poorly prepared was the health system in terms of PPEs, in terms of facilities in the ICUs, the moral decline, the fact that when you have the hospitals being filled, you have to go to the cathedrals in order to keep people there. So we didn't have that resilience that was needed to confront the current situation. Other countries were better prepared because in the large picture here, we have the situation of, for example, Wuhan, in which these people, probably they have more built-in resilience from previous experiences. They have better PPEs, they have better ICUs, so they could be able to flatten that curve, as I was discussed before, much quickly. Other collateral damage are at the global level, is that we are going to have reversals of decades of global progress, and because of the lack of social resilience. We have coming a hunger pandemic, a poverty tsunami. Look, we all know how terrifying the numbers are under normal situations in terms of starvation, 135 million people. Well, that's going to duplicate because of the pandemic. And also, let's not forget about the millions and millions of kids that are losing education opportunities. And obviously that is going to further feeding into that poverty and inequality tsunami that we were mentioning before. So we have identified the problems, and I think we can in the future precisely to develop the tools to compensate for those for that lack of resilience. And maybe you can finish with another example that is
and if you jump 2 slides actually to the final one about kind of making connections. So I think these are connections that we had all appreciated already, but they were faint connections. We knew that there were links between nutrition and immunity, between immunity and climate and nutrition, and all the other ones that I didn't mention. And very central to this is the fact that one virus, and again, I'll stress one virus with a few genes and a few thousand nucleotides, has really made evident how strong these connections were and how much of a lack of resilience we had built into all of our systems. And so I think that, you know, climate change research and also policy that has been made and tremendous inroads that have been made by companies investing in more sustainable practices is really something that actually scientists like myself and like ourselves and funders need to really learn from, of how do you change the way that we're measuring the impacts that we have, moving beyond maybe a total number of publications, which is somewhat reactionary to the way that science is taking place, and rather thinking about how we're investing in making more resilient systems. And so within that, we, you know, I think what I'll do is I'll kind of pause there and we can open it up for questions, but just say that, you know, elements that we didn't really touch on are things like the supply chain that is behind this, and elements that were just discussed towards the end were about education. And so things like funding and the proper supply chains and making supply chains that are flexible, and education that is also flexible and really empowering individuals across the world are really important. And I think that one of the common threads through all of this is that really we should be defining results through people as much as possible. And by investing in people, that we can really move towards having a better future, both towards pandemics and also the issue of climate change. So I see a lot of questions that have come in, and I don't know if we'll have to address all of them. But
I was having a hard time to select the best one because we are running out of time, but I think we could actually answer them offline as well. But I would like to ask you, I mean, we have some participants from Asia, for example, and we have a question regarding what would you say to countries that promote high food standards regarding the importance of good production practices from countries they import food from? What would you say? What would you recommend to those countries, in your opinion?
You take that.
Yeah. Me, I was going to say add food central to that. I mean, I think I can simply view this more as a consumer of food in a way, but I will link it actually back to vaccines because it's a very important question as well. But I think within our current food systems, it is amazing right now that in my fruit bowl, I can have fruit that doesn't grow in Massachusetts. I can have whatever fruit I want at any time of the year. That's awesome. But one should also ask itself, is that a good thing to do? You know, taking the banana as an example, we have these monocultures of bananas that have taken over certain countries to make sure that American supermarket shelves or Asian supermarket shelves can have bananas whenever they want. And the same is kind of true for vaccines, except we're not as good at actually making sure that vaccines make it onto the shelves in the right way. And so within the context of vaccines, I think it's really important to understand now that the supply chain for vaccines is very much in that way, where we centralize production in one country and then we distribute it to the rest of the world. And it's clear that both in food and also in our response to a viral pandemic, we need to think about how local supply chains and global supply chains are working together in concert. And again, I'm saying that purely theoretically because that is certainly not what I study, but it's something that I think people can appreciate because there is a certain power to local production and understanding what the immediate needs are of the people there. And yet also having access to that knowledge and those fruits and vegetables or vaccines that might be produced in other places more regularly.
That's great. I knew that you could make the connection.
Perfect. And one last question, and then we will I will pass the word to Anais so that she can close up. You both represent two very different generations of scientists. And what changes in behaviors, attitudes towards science have you witnessed throughout these years, in your opinion? And does science matter to society today? Would it matter even more in the future now that science is clearly perceived as a response to global risks, like for example, the developing of a vaccine for coronavirus?
Okay.
Yeah,
what's your opinion on that?
You go first there.
And then we can close them.
Yeah, I can speak from the point of view of decades, right, of changes in and I think we are going to end with the same conclusion. What I have seen during the past few decades is that science has broken the silos, the individuality, and then it has moved to collaboration, especially in the area in which we are working, in which you need really multidisciplinary teams. You need to collaborate with people across the world. 30 years ago, when somebody developed a new tool in genetics, they keep it like a treasure, right? They didn't share. They wanted to publish on that. Now it's different. Everything is almost real-time, distributed to your colleagues and to the common knowledge. So that's a major change that I have seen during my decades of lifetime. I pass it to you.
Yeah, and I think to build on that, so now kind of coming in and entering into that more collaborative environment, I think my generation is seeking to continue to expand on that idea and to even, dare I say, revolutionize it. And so I think that in many ways, again, it ties back to that idea of investing in people and general concepts and ideas over very maybe specific projects that could be applicable over the course of months or years. All of that needs to be tightly linked. But really the future that I want to see is that any young child growing up that has an interest in science doesn't have to make an economic calculation about whether or not it's a wise move to enter the broader scientific area. And here I'm talking broadly about academic or industrial science. It doesn't really matter to me. I think that you have this innate and intrinsic curiosity in people that in many ways our systems are very good at extinguishing. And we need to think about how we can be promoting that. Because when you have a more curious and a more inquisitive and kind of questioning society, then I think that makes a stronger fabric to be operating within. And so I think for me, that's really one of the powerful changes. So now, that we have this ability to build on those 30 years of individual to collaborative work. Now we think about how do we bring that collaborative effort to really a global scale. And I think that these are the things, again, tying on local to global, that we need to be thinking about. And it's really about building this culture of preparedness, and really investing in resilience and making sure that we're not stretched too thin and that we're ready to be able to respond, and that we have all the minds that want to be involved in a particular area to be able to making important contributions. And so that's the type of future that I hope to be able to see. And I hope to be able to learn from people in this kind of virtual room about how we can make that a possibility.
Thank you so much, both of you. Anais, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Jose Manuel and Jose Maria. I think we had much more questions, but we are going to pause here. And I'm going to wrap up and have a few concluding remarks. I have to say I'm extremely impressed by the talk we had today, in the sense that you really managed to brilliantly interconnect things that usually we don't really put together, which is, genes, climate change, nutrition, healthcare, but all of this with economy. Because this is, I think, the key point and the key call for action here is that we need to have, to build those shock absorbers. We need to build resilience. And to do this, we need to stop what we're doing today. We need to think long-term. We need to think about, new ways of funding fundamental research, because when pandemics happens, it's too late. We're not going to invest in 1 week into 10 years of scientific research that should have been done. So our call for action here really is to all the community here that's listening to us: help us build a climate and infectious disease resilient world by finding new ways of investing in fundamental research. I think we all need it, and it will only make any financial investor as well happier. It's not just a question of, doing good. It's a question of not repeating another economic collapse as well. So thank you very much, Jose Manuel and Jose Maria. It was fascinating. I'm going to pass it on to Marcela so that she can talk to us about the next webinars.
Yeah, thank you, Anais. Thank you. It was a great moderation despite the connection issues. And thank you, Luis Fuente, for stepping in and moderating part of this webinar and guiding us through this interesting discussion with our audience. Big thank you to our audience as well for attending this Ctrl+Alt+Delete when we build a webinar today. And a special thanks, of course, to Professor Ordovás and Dr. Ordovás-Montañes for an insightful presentation and discussion today. My takeaway: geography, biodiversity, environment, sustainability, global supply chain, education, well-being, values, finance, and hard economics are all very well represented by what we eat. I would like to take 30 seconds to leave our audience with two important statements that I heard from our panelists today as they apply as well to immunity, nutrition, and climate finance, our climate finance crusade. The first one, the more prepared you are, the less costly the next response will be. We need to be prepared. And we from IFC and the IFC Green Banking Academy are here to support our client financial institutions in this journey. My question to the audience today is, what are we learning from the present and what we should be not forgetting when it comes to prepare ourselves to address the global challenge of climate change, which has no boundaries? And the second statement, when we apply a change, we need to sustain it, love it. If we are really embracing a green rebuild, that should not be interchangeable. So two big statements for me today. Before we close, let me spend some minutes on a few announcements. First, as previously announced, all participants will see a very short survey on your right-hand side of their screens. We would be very grateful if you can take some minutes to fill it in, because for us, that's a way to receive your feedback and to improve our webinars. And on the other hand, you will be receiving a link with this recorded session in case you missed any part of it, and please feel free to share it. And finally, please don't miss our next webinar, where we will be discussing what are the main initiatives underway to frame climate risk management and how can banks incorporate climate risks into their risk management frameworks. We are going to have three great speakers: Jose Maria Roldán, President of the Banking Association of Spain; Giorgio Tretenero, Secretary General of the Latin American Federation of Banks, FELABAN; and Soledad Diaz Noriega, Partner at Management Solutions, and an important ally for the IFC Green Banking Academy to bring to you knowledge about climate risk. And I think that's it from our side. Thank you so much for joining this session, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.